My name is Shakil. My pronouns are he and him. I'm co-founder of Anima Leadership. Delighted you can join us today. If you're in the Canadian context, we're just on the other side of an election, still waiting to confirm whether there's going to be a majority or minority government. All the final votes are still coming in. So we are on the other side, at least this moment, of a stopgap measure, a momentary reprieve from the chaos. This is far from a temporary fix where we are, but just to say that it's an opportunity to take a breath. So I'm so delighted you can join me today because we're going to be talking about uh, a new framework that has been developed by a group of activists, and it's called Just Compassion. So I'm just putting that into the chat. So Just Compassion is a way of working towards human rights and justice goals, using an ethos of love, fairness, and forgiveness to get us there. So I'm going to talk about this framework and where it came to be from the first and why it came to be. So if you've been part of the anima community of the last decade, you'll know that part of the work that we've been trying to do is talk about some of the things that we're doing well in the justice world and things we're not doing so well. And that conversation uh, has been happening in small pockets. But I realized at a certain point that you know this is not a conversation that can happen just with one or two people. This needs to be bigger. So I reached out um, over a year ago to to Dr. Loretta Ross, who you folks will know if you were at our Anima conference. She's a colleague, a collaborator, and she's the author of the new book that came out, Calling In: How to Start Making Change with Those You'd Rather Cancel. So her and I co-founded a project that we called the Compassion-Based Leadership Project. And we convened a group of activists in Washington, D.C. that we felt would be like-minded in wanting to bring more compassion into the justice framework. And so we met in person in Washington last year as a group of it was a closed invitation. We just wanted specific people there. About 20, 25 invites had gone out, and we gathered in Washington, and then we um, continued to meet monthly since then. And so the outcome of that is this framework that we're calling Just Compassion. And this Just Compassion framework is really looking at the long game of human rights and justice work. And also taking this moment where democracies are under attack, authoritarianism is rising, fascism is rising, the polarization has been so intense. But to think about this, to say, okay, in spite of that, what's the long game? Where are we trying to get to? And we have to take this moment to recognize that while we've had some successes in the justice world and socializing ideas like privilege and being able to bring a conversation like systemic discrimination into the fore, systemic forms of racism, and so on, uh, we've also um, we've also had a lot of failures. But the thing is, in the justice world, it seems like we don't often talk about our failures. And sometimes um, that's for fear that it's going to distract us from the work we're trying to do. So some of us believe that that's an important thing to do, that we can't actually move forward without going, wait a minute, what's working and what's not working? So today, the anima community gets a little preview. We're going to be launching this in the US in June, and this is an opportunity for the anima community to have a bit of a preview on what we've been thinking. So I've defined what just compassion is, but I want to take us back and say, why did we feel the need for just compassion? So we identified through many, many conversations we identified a number of repeating themes that came up for us that helped us identify the need for a framework that was based on our practices and by people who are using compassion as a framework within the justice world. And so track which of these resonate for you. Okay. So some of these might, all these might, none of these might, I don't know. But if you're working justice, some of these likely will. Okay. So here's what we saw as things that we in the justice world have been doing that has been influencing our culture that have not been so helpful and in fact in many ways have been undermining our goals around justice and human rights. First of all, we identified goal confusion, that sometimes people fighting for human rights and justice care more about being right than actually making a difference. That's an aspect of what's our goal? What are we trying to do? Two, we identified that we are often very hard to understand. The way that activists talk, we can be too academic. We can come across as judgmental. What makes it hard for regular people, non-activists, non-progressives, to understand what we're talking about or even to feel welcome. Hurt relationships. There are many conversations of us talking about ourselves and our experiences. I've been involved in justice work for 30 years. Loretta's been involved for 50. We had so many people with many, many decades of experience among us. And we also described that sometimes we've noticed that activists can be quick to turn against each other. Sometimes we end up acting like the very people and systems that we're critical of, sometimes lacking empathy, being unnecessarily harsh in our words or actions, berating people. And that happens to not just people that we're trying to get onto the side of justice, but we're do it to each other. Four, too much blame, not enough learning. Justice education itself is identified as an area where, while we've had successes, we've also had a number of failures, intentionally or unintentionally. Justice education can make people feel shamed and blamed instead of helping them grow and learn through content, because the content around justice work is complex. We're trying to get people to take a high level view of what's happening around us, to take perspectives that we might not otherwise take in. But that's complex work and it's emotional. And my shorthand is that we've adopted the tools of the academic, which is argument, rationality, when we should have adopted more tools from the school teacher, which is to break complex concepts down in ways that are accessible, that are judgment-free, and meet learners where they are, not where we want them to be. We also identified that the cultural context around justice, that there's a fear. This is the most common thing we hear is there's a fear to speak up. Many people are just simply scared to ask questions or say what they really think because they don't want to be judged, misunderstood, or shunned. Okay. What we also identified is that we have some underdeveloped skills. What we've overdeveloped are what we call head skills, the cognitive, knowing the right answers. But we've underdeveloped the skills that are needed for right relationship, right actions, right strategies. Right relations, actions, and strategies, like that's more complicated. The right answer is easy. And frequently we get into that. And those interventions, while they can be useful, I would describe them as overdeveloped. So we need to balance head and heart, and we've overdeveloped head. Perfectionism and purity. This came up over and over again, is that there seem to be really unrealistic standards that have been set up for words we use, behaviors, actions, and goals. Um, and that can result in activist culture often feeling rigid, self-righteous, overly cynical, not particularly happy. We talk about the world and wanting to make it a better place, but we're mostly talking about how ugly and horrible it is. And there's an element of perfectionism that plays out. Always got needing the right answer, knowing what to say. Vulnerability is not particularly high. Perfectionism, unfortunately, is. And that results often in purity politics. You got to always have it exactly right. And if you even ask certain questions, you might be outcast because of it, simply for asking questions to understand. And that's, again, going back to fear, and it's tied to perfectionism. Lastly, one of the big themes is that we've pushed a lot of people out. The persuadables, people that should be on our side, are frequently not. So it's really hard to make large scale culture change if people that might support us are pushed away, excluded, or constantly made to feel bad. And again, it's because it seems like we're tied to perfectionist standards. None of that helps. Life's messy. And um, and we've got to be able to work with that complexity of life. So these were some of the main themes that came up as to why there's a need to rethink the long game of justice, to rethink the long game of human rights. Um, and one thing I'll go back to for a moment is the idea of goal confusion. Actually, I'll share it my next thing because it shows up next. So let me now get into what is just compassion. So just compassion um, um, is a way of accomplishing getting to human rights and justice goals, but using compassion, kindness, fairness, forgiveness to get us there. And so as we talked about this, we came up with 10 principles. Again, there have been many conversations over many months, and there were things that were circulating. So this is a summary of those conversations. We identified 10 principles that we thought were really important. One, notice injustice. Two, live MLK's dream. Three, our mindset goals, compassion, accountability, embracing imperfection, integrity matters, relationship intelligence, conflict competence, complexity thinking, strategy, diversity of tactics, and expanding the tent. Okay, so I'm going to go over these because these were the principles that came up. So to break these down, okay, the first thing that we said that we think we do quite well in the justice world is we notice injustice. So this is something that it's one of the goal categories is to notice injustice. And this is important in the principles of just compassion as well, is we need to see how some groups have more power, influence, and opportunities than others simply because of identity-based things like money or gender or race. And this unfairness has been happening for a long time and still affects people today. So that's one thing that we feel is an important principle. Two, another one of the goals in here is to live MLK's dream. So the idea of the inspiration of Dr. King's beloved community, um, that our daily practices should name and model the goal of building resilient and joyful communities that are able to repair harm, heal divisions, and dismantle unjust systems. So Dr. King's beloved community, Dr. King always spoke about the goal. Well, what do we talk about in justice? Our goal tends to be defined as anti-racism is to end racism. Anti-sexism is to end sexism. Okay, but that's not enough. What's on the other side? If we're not clear about what the other side is, then the goals we might be achieving might be transactional rather than transformational. So Right, we got more women in power. Okay, what's the culture feel like? We have more managers and leaders that are indigenous and folks of color. Okay, what does the culture feel like? Does it feel friendly? Can we, do we feel connected? Or is it some groups are now feeling a little bit better, but other groups are really feeling not great, right? So what's our goal? So one of the things about Dr. King that I've always really inspired, he was always articulating what the other side was looking like. It was going to be redemption. It was so that people across differences, people who were antagonistic to each other, even people who were perpetrating injustice, and he used those words, um, it was to befriend those people. So there was a vision that was powerful. Well, how often are we articulating a vision that's powerful? We we need to articulate that so that people go, "Oh, that's what you're fighting for. Okay, I can get behind that." All right. But we don't do that enough. We just end racism. It's not enough. Okay, let me keep going. So the first two principles we're putting under a category called goals, more just for organization. Okay. The next three principles are under the context of mindset. Okay. The idea of a mindset of being compassionate and accountable. To fix broken relationships and unfairness, we need to be compassionate to ourselves and others, but also take responsibility for the harm we may have caused. Okay, so that's where accountability comes in. Okay. The other part of the mindset is to embrace imperfection. And this is so important because we recognize that we're going to be imperfect. We're going to say the wrong things. We're going to um, be strong in one area and weak in another and not even know it. We're going to say things that, as a question that might have hurt somebody, we didn't know that. But we got to be in that conversation to learn. Um, and so this embracing imperfection embraces the messiness of our lives rather than striving to be like the perfect activist or perfect person. Integrity still matters here. So integrity is still important, that acting with honesty, trustworthiness, and strong moral principles is essential, right? Embracing imperfection doesn't take away from integrity. And this means doing what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular, and taking responsibility for our actions and admitting to our mistakes. Okay, so you're starting to see how these things start overlapping, but they still need articulation. The next three are skills we've identified. This broad category of relationship intelligence is really important. That to build a better world, we have to get a good understanding of ourselves, our own biases, our own quirks, our own strengths, our own weaknesses. To be able to understand that in ourselves and in other people, which means feedback is essential, which means relationships and conversations essential, means that self-control, kindness, and how to heal from pain and is essential. So that relationship intelligence, we could have like 10 things under it. We're putting that as one banner because it's an area of deep skill development. Part of that is conflict competence. And while relationship intelligence, sometimes conflict can fall underneath it, we felt it just needed its own statement because we just need to get good at working through our disagreements, our misunderstandings, and our conflict. We want to build bridges with each other, break down that perfectionism, and even build bridges with those who think and act different than us. Okay? Because we're not going to achieve justice and human rights goals without working through a lot of issues. And it's not going to be because everyone believes and talks like we do. That's not how it's going to work. It's going to be others learning from us and us learning from them. That means we got to be in conflict because in conflict, there is the possibility, the deep possibility of generative things emerging, things that we couldn't imagine before. But we got to be in it, in the heat. Really important. Complexity thinking is part of this too, which just acknowledges that social problems aren't simple. It's not just about right or wrong answers. We need to be able to handle complicated situations and be okay with not always having clear answers, with being in uncertainty. um, of just being in darkness at times, but still being connected, and realizing that sometimes our theories give us great answers to certain things, but once you get on the ground, that's not that's not always as easy. I always um, struck by an example I remember from way back in the day, which really sort of also exemplifies the idea of head skills. I remember doing a presentation, and I was at a big conference, and I was talking about work in youth leadership and doing work around race and identity and differences. And we I remember sharing a story about a young 17-year-old uh, white girl, a white young woman, sorry, and in these conversations around power and privilege, her background, which she didn't speak a lot about, but sort of shared off to the side, was that in her home, there's a lot of mental health issues, and she had spent a considerable part of her young life being the primary caregiver to her parents, and so the simplicity of just saying, well, yes, you have privilege. It just rings a little hollow in a situation where someone's individual experiences are so intense. And so I remember telling this story, and I contextualized it and talked about where it was coming from and why it was important for us to also think about that, because that's not an easy answer. And at the end of it, a prof came up to me at the presentation, um, and someone who's clearly steeped in anti-racism work. And his response to me was, I think you let that 17-year-old off the hook. And I was like, I let a 17-year-old off the hook. I was like so stunned, I didn't know what to say to him. I was like, okay. So at that point, see, he's got the right answer. In anti-racism work, white people have privilege. But while that's true, there's also this other truth for this particular context. It feels a little hollow to tell this 17-year-old who's like basically parenting her parents and making ends meet in ways that are really complicated, that she's somehow got privilege. I mean, yeah, we can have that conversation, but the fact that we're just letting it going, the easy answer is don't let her off the hook. That's also the heady answer. It's not, in my world, a compassionate answer. There might be a conversation at some point where I might talk to that young woman and bring to attention things like around her whiteness, but just simply based on her whiteness, that her conditions were somehow less than, so much so that a professor who is steeped in this work of justice can flippantly say, I think you let her off the hook. See, that's the right answer. That's not the right relationship in my world and in the world of just compassion. Okay. So, complexity thinking takes that in and says, well, what's the context and how do we have these conversations? And what about these different things that are more than just perpetrator victim? That perpetrator victim polarity only has one other part of that triangle, which is a rescuer. And the world is much more complex than victims, perpetrators, and rescuers. Yet within the justice world, that's frequently, consciously, unconsciously, how we see the world. We're more than that. All of us are more than just our identities. Okay? So we've got to play with those and be okay with playing with those. Our last two principles that I want to share in just compassion is the idea we put in these under the category of strategies. That diversity of tactics is so important. There's no one right way to make change. We need lots of different approaches and should trust each other, and we don't always agree. Okay. But frequently what will happen is um, people will shut down ideas before they even begin. Um, and I find that so interesting um, and short-sighted. It also means that we can never scale anything. experimentation goes out of the way if we're constantly only putting forward ideas that are only possible in these really micro things, micro projects or micro initiatives that can never be scaled up. Okay, well, that's not going to be that useful if it's that contextually specific. So how do we embrace the fact that we're doing different things? Okay. Um, and lastly, expanding the tent. To make big changes, we have to find ways to bring different groups of people together, even people who don't totally agree with us. And we want to build strong. We want to build big, strong teams, movements, cultures, organizations that are fighting for fairness. Now, these last 2 points are important, expanding the tent, diversity of tactics, because just compassion is a strategy. Overall, it's a way of approaching the world. I think it's particularly important in the context of education because that's my area. Okay. Even taking the time and energy to convene activists to think about this, people could criticize that. And they could say, what are you wasting time doing that for? The world's falling apart and you're gathering activists to have a conversation about what's not working. What's the matter with you? Right? It's a legit thing. And my response would be, this is my purpose. This is what I'm meant to do. This is the tactic that myself and Loretta and the people who feel like-minded feel this is an important strategy to also help move forward, not because the other strategies being used right now on the ground to defend immigrants and refugees and people who identify as transgender, not because those things aren't needed, but those are absolutely needed. But I'm not doing that. We're doing this because we also think that someone has to be looking at the trajectory and be able to offer something back to our community that says, let's talk about some other things that can help us. And that's not to beat down on activists. Everyone in this project is an activist, but to be honest with ourselves and say, right, what could we do better? What's not going so well? And not because we're going you, but because like, oh, we've all done this. We've all been part of this. These are things that haven't been that helpful. So these are the 10 principles. We'll write them in, and maybe Rebecca, you can, or someone on my team could just cut and paste them in so you've got access to them.
I can pop them in.
Thank you. So how do you use these principles? Like, what are they good for? Like, great, good thinking. What are you going to do with them? Okay, so I want to share with you the next step, which is what can you use these for? Well, um, we're going to share some starting points. It's not the end all and be all, but this is where some initial thoughts from us as to where you can use these. So first of all, this can be used as a tool in groups or coalitions coming together in the process of guidelines or helping you think about guidelines. Have we talked about our goals? Have we talked about how we're articulating, how we're going to model these things? Have we talked about how diversity of strategies? Have we talked about how we're going to work through conflict? Like this can be a little bit of a checklist as you're also thinking about creating group guidelines. 2, facilitator back pocket. Okay, leader back pocket. As we're supporting our groups, in-house or externally, we can bring these principles out as questions to guide our observations and intentions, right? Hey, I want to go back to what the articulated goal was at the beginning. Is this modeling that? I'm just checking. We talked about working through conflict. I think we're in a moment right now where it's hot. And let's go back to our principles around conflict and how are we doing with those over the last week or over the last part of the project. So as facilitators and leaders, we can use this as a place to go because in the moment, especially if it's gotten really hot or triggered, we can be kind of losing our focus and we get pulled in different directions. This can be an anchor to come back to. Hey, let's go through this just to see where we are and what might be most needed in this moment. What part of this project is fulfilling these needs? This can also be used in program and strategy development. Okay, as a tool for groups developing their theories of change or strategies or plans. Again, it can be a little bit like, hey, have we included this? Have we thought about this? Have we put something in that addresses these issues? So again, it becomes a reference tool. Okay. We are actually going to be sharing with you how we're going to use just compassion at our May Cafe, and we're going to have an assessment tool for you to try. Okay. And again, it'll be something that can be used as an idea, as a conversation starter, whether it's on a team, in an organization, whether it's in a coalition of work that you're doing at different levels. It'll be an assessment that you can work with to generate conversations. Okay. And also, what we also want to do, and we're going to share this also in our next cafe, is we're going to talk about practices and behaviors. So, for each of the 10 areas, what are example practices and behaviors that we can actually see in real time? Okay, that you want to bring in, because without the practices and behaviors, it's just another piece of paper. Okay, it's just nice words, but what do they translate to in action? So we're going to come at that next session with some strategies and behaviors underneath each of these. So you could go in and look and say, okay, what do they mean by the idea of live MLK's dream, right? What do they mean? What's an example of conflict competence? Like, what would that look like in a meeting? What would that mean? So we're going to try to put in both things that are micro as well as some things that are a bit more macro, that can go under each of these, because we really want this framework to be practices and behaviors oriented so that you can um, use this in whatever context you're in. Okay. Not because it is a perfect tool, not because it is the end all and be all of something, but this is the best thinking and feeling that a group of us, um, as I said, co-founded with Dr. Loretta Ross, that we've come up with as a way of thinking again about the long game, because we've seen where we are. And even in this time of crisis and chaos, we still have to be thinking about where we want to go. And so again, I'm reminded about Dr. King's words. Well, regardless of where we are, I want the other side to feel better. I want it to be a place where there's hope and redemption and where reconciliation is possible and where there was oppression, there is now friendship. Those are things that are important to me. We're not there, but how do we get there? And how do we get there, more importantly, in our day-to-day lives? How do we taste those things in our day-to-day lives so that that future vision rests on something that's real? Okay. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn over to you. First of all, what was helpful? You all came and took your time. It was advertised as just compassion. What was helpful? What did you get from this that was useful as an insight or an aha? And then we'll move to questions and comments after. But first, just reflections. What was helpful about what you heard?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I think what was really meaningful for me was to have some of these things reflected back. I've been so struggling with how to build the resiliency to talk to people who aren't always like-minded or in the same value set because of how activated or triggered I could be by something they say that's, oppressive or messed up, and having to build the resiliency for, you know, peer-based learning and teaching, like giving people compassion of the reason why they've gotten to where they are around their thinking, or like what, as a privileged person, for example, as a non-disabled person, I benefit from so many things, privileges. I don't get treated a certain way because I'm non-disabled. And so there's a place in where I've learned that my privilege is just normal, right? And so if I'm constantly called out by activists, like I get small, and I don't know how to always be good or be right or sit in my knowledge without shaming myself. So why am I doing that to others, you know? So it's a really tricky thing around building resiliency to care for folks and help them in their learning and get us to a place from oppression to friendship. Like I love that piece, you know, and it's definitely like a work, a piece of self-work that I have so much more to do.
I'll do. Thanks, Deb. Appreciate that. Um, Pay, and then I think I saw Mohammed.
Hi, thanks for doing this, Shakil. It's always so uplifting. Um, I guess what strikes me is how do you break through and create a new platform, a new area of discussion, a new way of connecting. And, you know, so often, and this is just something we're playing with, we're experimenting with, and I think is the basis of any real change or transformation is having these new words and ways of dealing with things and not being uncomfortable to do it. You know, it's pretty deep. And I guess working on oneself, I like when you said like working on oneself and how do we bring these things in day to day in our own lives as a practice opportunity or as an awareness, is a beautiful place to start. And groups like this.
That's great. I think Mohammed, you were up next.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm relatively newer to this space, but I think I really appreciating how the work is grounded in conversations of what hasn't worked. And I think that notion of how do we actually create that space within our own institutions, because there's often momentum and the intentions are good, right? Which is really you see an injustice, you want to discuss it and try to address it. But we don't often like, so I think we fall into the work without necessarily having these conversations. And I think I appreciate that, as I'm sort of in that initial stages of finding new groups and so on, like how do we actually have that conversation? And I think the principles that you've outlined are a starting point for that. So thank you for taking that time, and it creates the language, I think, to foster that dialogue that may not otherwise happen. So I'm sort of going to be reflecting on that as a takeaway.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Mohammed. Great. Um, Other reflections, other comments? Rebecca, you want to give us a little highlight of some of the things that are in the chat?
Yeah, so there's a lot that stood out to folks. Definitely this concept of thinking about the other side, where we're going, what that could look like. One thing that definitely resonated with people is this concept of not looking for the right answer, but instead pursuing the right relationship. Um, as it's a good reminder that, blaming, shaming, casting out is not always the most effective way forward. And this work can be very complex. So it's really important to embrace imperfection. One thing I really do want to point out, it seems like a lot of folks were feeling downtrodden in their work, feeling negatively and couldn't really voice why. And these principles have given that a bit of framework. And there's a little bit of feelings of hope and feelings of like, okay, now I can actually start to process what might be holding me back or what might be feeling very heavy for me, and help start to move out of disillusionment around Jedi work.
Right. Okay,
Yeah, definitely a lot about how this has articulated a lot of the ways in which folks have been feeling about Jedi work recently.
right. So I want to make something really concrete. A big part of the work that Anima does, about 50% of our work, is we do audits of organizational systems, especially when it comes to HR inside organizations. That's like half of our work now. And that also means we do things like focus groups. So, we ran a focus group recently, and it was with BIPOC employees, people identified as Black, Indigenous, people of color. And once again, what were the stories that we heard? We heard that, you had employees that really were motivated to want to get ahead, to learn, and yet it seemed like every time they tried to raise their hand, no one noticed. When they talked about opportunities to grow and move into other roles, they didn't get supported while they watched other people who didn't look like them, who were more normative, get those opportunities. So basically, what we heard was the real life stories of people of color, which is data that has been around for decades. We have mountains of that data and that's why we talk about systemic forms of discrimination. So these very committed staff are now just like, I get so wiped out. All I do now is put my head down and I just make it. I've turned to a 9 to 5 job. And others are like, and I'm actively considering looking for other jobs, right? This is cliched, it's old, it's tried and true. So that's the stuff that we're working on in justice. Okay. What we lose track of is how we do the work. And in how we talk about justice work, we have convinced some people that the world of diversity, equity, inclusion is not for them. So right now, the conservatives in Canada, for example, the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader, his staunchest base is young men under the age of 30. Solid, not moving. Doesn't matter what happens. Same thing with Trump. And these are millennials. These are people who grew up in this generation, and yet they feel alienated from us. So while we work on uplifting and tackling anti-Black racism and racism in all its forms and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and things like that, we have to be thoughtful about who we're also bringing in and who we're pushing away. And so inadvertently, because we use the tools of the academic, we push people away because we're always saying, white man, white man, white man, white people, white people, white people. It's not hard for that to be translated to white equals bad. Heterosexual male equals bad. And then guess what? They're looking for a different club to go to. So can we hold the complexities of all of this work? Because that's how complicated it is. But guess what? We've only been focused on the one groups that we feel most connected to. And for good reason. But some of us also have to work and orient ourselves and use language that will bring and unite people while we do the work of justice. And that's why the goals are so important, but also the how is so important. So I just want to put that out there that, I don't want us to forget about the original reasons for justice work. We're doing that. We have to do that. But we also have to make our work more complicated so that we're not pushing people out. And reality is we've been pushing people out. There's a reason why there's so many women on this call and why the dominant group that comes to justice work, and certainly in the context of Anima, predominantly tends to be women, right? So what are we doing that's not making it welcoming? Let's be thoughtful about that. Not because we want to minimize sexism or misogyny, that's very real, but can we hold that and also use language and create processes that also allow men to feel welcome, that allow white people feel welcome, to allow Palestinian Arabs to feel welcome, to allow Jewish people to feel welcome, to allow straight people and queer people. And that's not easy because you're going to have all these voices. Now you see why conflict competence becomes so important. Now do you see why we have to start thinking about the goal of beloved community, of reconciliation, of repair, of redemption, why all of that has to be there? Because we're not dropping one. We have to hold all of it. And in the justice world, we've been only holding one side because we feel like society's not holding it down. It's okay, but we have to be non-polarized while we do it. All right. Questions or comments?
Question or
Yeah,
comment.
go ahead.
Good to see you. So I guess I work in post-secondary, and one of the things that I think about a lot is that we have to, and I love all of that, what you said. One of the challenges is trying to convince others that are above you that, valuing relationships, valuing dialogue is important. And so that I often feel like there's a communication gap of, the trying to, there's a lot of comfort in a very punitive system of like, this person did wrong. What policies did they breach? But there's much less interest in like, let's try to figure out what happened. How do we repair harms and move forward? And this is basically like a restorative justice framework. But I find it very hard to, they're like, we don't have time to talk about these things. Right? We don't have time to repair relationships. We have these things to do. And so I wonder if you had any suggestions on how you can communicate it in a way that leaders will listen.
It's, I think what you're talking about is leaders that haven't bought in, period, full stop, whatever you're working on, right? Whatever you're working on, whether it's justice, whether it's, reconciliation work, whether it's, restorative work, that they haven't bought in. So ultimately, there's not one answer to that. What I always think about is a few things. One, that you always work in teams, you never work alone, right? So you never show up to a meeting um, uh, um, without thinking about it in a grassroots kind of way. I can't just raise this issue. Probably going to be best if I show up with, 3 or 4 other people that feel equally important, that this is an important issue. Two, there's always leadership people who are soft, meaning that soft in they have a family member, they got skin in the game, they got a child that has autism. So build those personal relationships. Three, um, know that you're in a long-term process. You're not gonna fix it um, uh, right away. Some leadership teams are really gonna get opened up really quickly, and other ones are gonna take a lot of time because they're just not there yet, right? So some of it is also your own sustainability. Like I knew one leader who basically, worked and strategized, and it took 3 years before a senior leader finally bought in. And then once that door opened, lots open. So some of it is patience while also being impatient, right? So it's all these sort of polarities that you play with, and your own ability to be in brave conversations while also managing yourself, managing your own self-care, your own ability to hold your own stuff so that you're not frazzling as well. So there's not one answer. It's like there's multiple strategies you'd need to use to get into that, to get them to buy into whatever you're trying to get them to buy into. Okay. So you, in many ways, if you don't have leadership on board, you become the instrument for change. You've got to model it and you got to be in it. You got to be strategic while sustaining yourself and not burning yourself out. Okay. That's at least a starting point. Okay. We are almost at time, people. If there's any other final comments you have about the framework or any other questions, we're going to do this again. There's going to be a part two to this, and it will be, I believe it's May 30th. Is that correct, team? I think it is. Anyhow, you will get the follow-up, and there we will continue this conversation. We're going to have an instrument for you to use that can be a great conversation starter, as well as a planning tool, as well as a design tool. And we're also going to talk about behaviors. So come back if you found this useful, spread the word. Come back to our next cafe where we're going to dive further into just compassion. And um, and if you found today useful, go try out. Let us know how that's going. Again, we built it because of our own practices, and now we're articulating it from the place of we have practices, but we need a framework within to guide this so that other people can jump into the framework. So if you found that useful, Wonderful. If you have questions, challenges, concerns, also wonderful. Please send them our way. You can put in the chat or follow up with an email. Appreciate your time, as always, being here. And at this point, I'm going to invite us to say goodbye. Please come off mute and give gratitude to each other and say goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Dankeschön.
Thanks, Shakil. Bye.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
All right. Take care.
Like which?